Welcome back to another segment of Ask Dr. Steve. My name is Dan Mucci, and I am the Mission Advancement Director here at CNA. And today we are going to examine the topic of parents placing too much pressure on their child or athlete. Steve, certainly another interesting topic to dissect today. In the past, you've provided some viewpoints from a parent perspective, and even, when I coached youth sports, how we should be looking and handling these things. But before I provide some insights, how do you feel as an athlete? Like, did you feel your parents placed an undue amount of pressure on you to succeed? And if so, how did you react or handle it? And of course, you were a youth and not in your professional state of mind now. So any thoughts and feelings from your perspective before we start?
Yeah, well, it's a complex discussion, and I look forward to having it. It's good to see you again. You know, in retrospect, in some ways, I don't think my parents put a lot of pressure on me, but I still felt like I was in this pressure cooker, probably because I had my own internal pressure going on. I had societal, maybe not even pressure, but like emphasis. You're the big man on campus. They hear you're being recruited. The community kind of applauds your success. So that kind of, you get reinforced in other types of ways based on that performance. So I think all that is kind of circling around that makes it very figural for you in your own sense of identity and the thing that you're finding importance in and the thing that you're putting a lot of effort and energy into as well. So even though my parents didn't, I don't think, overtly put a ton of pressure on me, simply them bringing it up from time to time, it would be like I was a wet cat. And so I think as we discuss some of these things today, it's important to recognize you're not going to get this perfect, but it's just a matter of kind of understanding the importance of progress and just being mindful of, and just having that little extra 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, thinking through, okay, how do I want to ask this question? Should I even ask this question? Do I want to bring this up now? Do I want to wait? And you're going to screw it up, but just being a little more intentional, I think, is really a big outcome from this conversation.
Yes, and intentional is always a big part of your philosophy. And so be interesting to see how you break intentionality down in today's segment. So as always, we try to break this down into a coach's and athletes and a parent's perspective. Of course, we know today that we may be a little bit more heavy on the parental side than the other two sides, just because of the nature of the topic. But let's just get started and dive in.
Let's do it.
So as always, we start off with our coaches. So is there anything really at the beginning of a season a coach can do to provide some tips to his athlete on minimizing those outside pressures? And of course, as you mentioned, that does include family members, but it also could be like this year's team is expected to win their league title, or this year's team is supposed to be really good, like nobody should compete with them. So what are some tips that coaches can give their athletes?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, and again, this isn't necessarily about coaches putting pressure on the athletes. This is how coaches can kind of absorb the reality that maybe family, community could be putting pressure on the athletes. So I think naming that pressure is a reality and something that many athletes may face and kind of normalizing it, I think could be very impactful. And a coach could really specify that, we, when you choose to participate in this team, we want to be elite. We want to be successful. Yes, we want to have fun. Yes, we want to celebrate our opportunity to participate in sport. And we want to show up. We want to do well for ourselves, for our community, etc. And with that can come pressures, expectations, belief systems about how we may need to show up, what our season needs to look like. And so I think it's important for us as a team to recognize those things, but also do the things that we ultimately are able to do and that we have control over, which is do our role successfully, continue to work hard, be good teammates, have fun, communicate with us as coaches. And as long as we're able to do that in our bubble, we're going to control that. Whatever happens outside of our bubble, we don't necessarily have as much control over. So I think that type of conversation starting off from a coach to his or her athletes, I think can be pretty impactful.
Great. So we've discussed in previous, sessions about the importance of those mental health check-ins from a coach. Is this an area where a coach may have a discussion with his athletes when they're checking in, especially maybe if they notice the athlete's making a few more mistakes in practice than maybe he or she normally would?
Yeah, for sure. And it can almost be cliche a little bit for some athletes when they start making these mistakes. You can see visually just how behaviorally and demonstrative they are. Like, come on, like, can't you get this? Not again, and hitting themselves on the head and such. Um, and if you see those things to a higher degree than what they typically might show up, or if that's even like a bit of personality trait, I think it's always a good opportunity to check in just in general proactively. But also that could be a good sign of, hey, I noticed that you're kind of taking some of these mistakes and errors a little bit more to heart than you typically do. You were able to just brush some of these things off before, and now it seems like you're really kind of hanging on to them and having difficulty letting them go. What's going on? And again, I mean, that was a 15-second lead in. So those little mental check-ins can go a long way. One, they're noticing, hey, it's an opportunity to release the pressure valve for that athlete and to let the coach know, what's up and what they might be able to do about it.
Yeah, and so with some of those mistakes, maybe what advice may a coach provide an athlete to have discussions with their parents about the pressure the athlete's feeling? Because if you make a mistake in a game, everybody sees it. So, it may get addressed as home as well as at school or in that locker room.
Yes. And these are conversations that I think need to have proactively, um, because when the emotion of the game of the sport is like paramount and simultaneous, it can make it more difficult to have an evolved conversation with the parent or a coach during those times. So I think level setting and having some groundwork ahead of time can be very important. So that could be something again that a coach brings up, maybe even in a parent meeting, is having conversations with your children, your student athletes, about how do you want to manage these expectations? How do you want to talk about these expectations? How do you want to have conversations about one's performance? And so if that's kind of set up ahead of time, then as a coach, you can turn to your athlete and say, hey, how are things like at home beyond the locker room here? Like, are your parents kind of giving you a lot of pressure? And these are delicate conversations, and certainly maybe not necessarily tips that you're going to get from a podcast on how to have these, but establishing a good relationship with the athlete, asking, hey, I noticed that you're having a lot of pressure put on yourself. It seems like it, at least. Where is this coming from? Oh, it's coming from my parents. Oh, okay, interesting. Have you been able to talk to them? In what types of ways have you been able to talk to them? Oh no, it's been kind of challenging. Oh, I can understand. I can appreciate that. And maybe it gets to a point where maybe even coach could involve him or herself in that conversation with the parents, depending on the circumstance as well.
So as we know, some youth sports before, which is completely different than high school athletics. I realize that. But at the outset, when I had a parent meeting, I tried to remind the parents that you're really there just to enjoy watching your child play, whatever sport he or she is participating. And typically after a game, a coach's role or responsibility is at some point to talk to the athlete about the mistakes they've made during the game. That could be in film session, obviously in high school. The kids pretty much know they've made the mistake themselves. So, and I know it's challenging from a parental side, sitting on the other side watching my kids play too. So how can kids again or coaches minimize that critique? Is it more like when you get in the car, it's just like, don't talk about the game, or when you get home, like there's a 24-hour period, games off limit? Like, what other things in addition to what you just said can you do when the coach and the athlete already know what the mistakes are and then it's compounded somewhere else?
Yeah. Again, I think this is going to be possibly alleviated if there's some form of discussion and contracting prior to the season going on, particularly with athlete and parent. What is the expectation after a game? Do you like talking about these things? And yeah, I mean, this might not be a conversation you have with a fourth or a fifth grader about this. Like maybe you do recognize they're just out there having fun and it's not as big. But when you get into athletics and some of that pressure comes up, and there's possibly opportunities to play afterwards and such after high school, these things become a little bit more important to have. So I think that contracting can go a long way. Again, because there's some athletes that might really enjoy that conversation. I might imagine like a quarterback and their dad played quarterback, and they might really enjoy kind of this, oh yeah, I messed that one up because they did the out route, and so they might really enjoy that. And others like, geez, it's just a Friday night, I happen to play a sport, like can we just be done with this? So again, it's going to be personality dependent. Having that contracting, I think, is paramount.
Yeah, and I think sometimes from a coaching or a parent perspective, if you've played that sport and then your kid is playing that sport, there's all those dynamics in like, you should have been looking here, you should have done this, you should have hit the tennis ball down this alley, or you should have spiked the ball at the net instead of kind of, whatever happened. So
Yeah, and I think there's, even for a recognition of some parents who might not have played a sport, this understanding that viewing, reviewing, evaluating performances, both successful performances as well as mistakes and errors, is part of the athletic endeavor. And most teams, at least to some degree, are going to engage in that process after a game, after a competition. And so for parents to remind themselves that, okay, they have a container, the athlete and the coach and the rest of the team, they have a container to do some of these things. It is not necessarily going to be, it shouldn't necessarily, it doesn't need to be part of my role or responsibility to engage in that review process with the athlete. They have a container for that.
And so that's, pretty much from the coach's perspective. Anything you think we missed that a coach could recognize or do to help their athlete alleviate some pressure?
I think, again, a recognition that a coach is very much a role model and an influence within the community. And if a coach is a hothead, um, it may increase the likelihood that we have parents that are hotheads. And if a coach puts a ton of pressure on their athletes, it may increase the likelihood that the parents put a ton of pressure on their athletes. So being mindful of your role as a leader and the influence that you might have on parents and how parents may communicate and engage with not only the coach, but also the student athlete as well. And I will also say, as we're talking about this just as a whole, pressure has gotten like this bad rap a little bit, like they're putting too much pressure on me. And we also have an opportunity to change the relationship that we have with pressure. Some of this is on ourselves as individuals who are choosing to put ourselves in challenging environments. If you're choosing to put yourself in a challenging environment, pressure is going to be part of that. And if you don't want that pressure, choose a different thing to engage in. But it's 2023. This is the nature of sports. And when you're in sports, there's pressure that's associated with that. When you're in a high level job, there's pressure that's associated with that. If you're a high performer in music, there's pressure that comes for that. If there wasn't, anybody could do it. And so I think that's also a recognition that, and this somewhat gets into the role of athletes, as an athlete, as a high performer, whatever that might be, you have to recognize that if I'm choosing to do this, I need to grow up a little bit too and recognize, yeah, people are going to ask me about my mistakes. People are going to ask me about my successes. People are going to critique me. People are going to give me feedback, solicited and unsolicited. That kind of comes with the territory a little bit. So part of it is that ownership, but also I think other individuals, coaches, parents, community needs to recognize their role a little bit too.